Welcome to Engineers Ireland, and on behalf of the Roads and Transport Society, I'd like to all welcome you here this evening for what will prove to be a very interesting presentation by John Heffernan, who's from the Dublin Airport Authority. Tonight's lecture is on the Dublin Airport, which is experiencing record passenger numbers at present, with passenger numbers due to exceed 26.5 million by 2016. And investment continues to run at a pace with two major projects planned for the immediate future, being the development, a commercial development at the airport, and also Runway 2. The commercial development will provide modern, sustainable office developments adjacent to Terminal 2 with 70 hectares, which is 30 hectares of prime development land. And ultimately the airport may develop a further 300,000 square metres of prime commercial development within the 70 acres on a phased basis. The new runway will parallel the existing main runway at the airport and will be 3.1 kilometres, facilitating direct travel to further attractive destinations in Asia, Africa and South America. Full planning was secured in 2007 and construction is due to commence shortly. Both projects will contribute to the airport's position as the country's premier transport hub and a major gateway into Ireland, and will benefit significantly from the recent announced metro development. Tonight's speaker is John Heffernan. He's the Chief Development Officer at the DAA since 2014. At the DAA, he is responsible for all capital projects, including the second runway project, the new airport city development, and the ongoing 5-year capital investment programme. Before the DAA, he co-founded and ran Clear Power Ltd, a leading bioenergy company in the UK and Ireland. Clear Power provides waste remediation and recycling services to many of Ireland's county councils. It was Ireland's largest supplier of biomass heating service products and provided biomass heating and electrical solutions to large commercial and industrial clients, including the NHS in the UK, the the London Olympic Stadium Park, B-Sky-B and E.ON. Clear Power was acquired in 2013 by DCC plc and incorporated into the Envia and Flowgas business in Ireland and the UK. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John to the stage and his presentation. Thanks, John.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Hello everyone, you're very welcome along, and thanks very much for having me tonight. So thanks for the introduction, and I won't hesitate by adding to that, and I'll just get straight into my presentation. So really what I wanted to cover tonight was firstly just to give you a sense of Dublin Airport, the last few years at Dublin Airport, which have been very interesting, with a significant rebound experienced. Then I'm going to talk next about the runway project, which you may have heard a little bit about. I'll talk about what we're calling Dublin Airport Central, which is our new commercial airport city development at the airport, and then a little bit about our surface access strategy and mobility plan, which I thought might be interesting for you guys in the roads sector, and that's really what I was going to cover, and then finish up and take any questions you had. Just a brief word on DAA. So I think you're all fairly familiar with DAA, but just to let you know, it's not just Dublin Airport. It's a business that has 4 business units. First of all, there's Dublin Airport in the middle there, which is obviously our largest business, which and I'll speak a bit more about that. The strategy within Dublin Airport is all about the gateway into Ireland and providing an outstanding airport experience for both our airlines who are our customers, and the passengers, obviously. We also run Cork Airport, which is a regional airport for the south of Ireland, much smaller in terms of passenger numbers, obviously, than Dublin, but extremely important for the south and southwest of the country. ARI is Rienta International, so that is an international duty-free business, which is probably one of the most global duty-free businesses around. We operate nearly 20 shops, right from Auckland through to the Indian subcontinent, Jakarta, big presence in the Middle East, a major presence in Canada, and obviously the shops as well in Ireland. And finally, DAA International is an international based business which operates a international consulting airport management business, but also a management contracting business. So, first major win was the airport in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, where we operate the new Terminal 5. Just moving back to Dublin Airport, so in fact we'll do a little bit better than the number of passengers you mentioned in the introduction. I think this year we'll be at 27.5 million, so considering that 2 years ago at the end of 2014 we had around 21.5 million passengers, it's a tremendous leap forward in those 2 years, and I'll explain a little bit why that has been. We do have the busiest route in Europe and the second busiest route within the world. So I'll leave you to think about what the busiest one might be, and I'll come back and tell you at the end. But a hint is that it also involves 2 cities separated by water, and it's not in Europe. We've 34 airlines, and we have 2,200 departing flights a week. We're the 14th best connected airport in the world. Sorry, in Europe, which is very interesting because connectivity is a major indicator of an airport's importance. For example, we're more connected than Gatwick, which might be a surprise, but Gatwick is an airport that really has a lot of holiday destinations which are point to point. Dublin Airport being being the 5th or 6th major, depending on how you count it, transatlantic hub, it increases our connectivity. Plus, we also have 26 UK destinations. Myself, before I joined Dublin Airport, I based my business in Dublin, despite the fact that most of it was in the UK, because it was actually much easier to get to anywhere in England from Dublin than it was from London or south of London. We support about 16,000 jobs directly on site in the campus. That's both in obviously the airlines, the airport, and the supporting businesses. And we fly to 180 destinations. So that's a slide that shows the growth that we've had. So you'll see there in 2015 down the bottom right hand corner of the page there that we grew by 3.3 million passengers in 2015, and looks like we'll grow by an additional 2.5 this year as well. That's a major rebound. Obviously, you may remember soon after Terminal 2 opened in 2009, 2010, there was a dramatic fall off in passenger numbers. So we actually fell from about 23 million down to just below 19 million that you'll see there in almost as rapid a time. So it's been a fairly chaotic 7 or 8 years at the airport. What's driven that growth in the last few years? Well, obviously the abolition of the travel tax helped as a kind of a catalyst in 2014, and that provided, I think, certainly a catalyst for Ryanair to, as they changed strategy, to add a lot of connectivity from Dublin. Dublin would obviously be a very, very significant hub or base for Ryanair, probably number 2 after Stansted. Very competitive short-haul fares, aided obviously by the low price of oil at present, and then very, very strong new routes and also extra capacity to existing routes. So many of our routes have seen large capacity growth. We had 9 new airlines come to the airport last year. Since the takeover of Aer Lingus by IAG, we've seen strong growth on the transatlantic, with new routes added last year and this year, and some more coming on next year. And we've also become, our transfer business has grown largely. So from a small base, so it's only approximately 1 million of our 27 million passengers, but that is set to grow significantly. And you may have heard there are always ongoing discussions between Ryanair and Aer Lingus about feeding transfer passengers from one to another. And I think that'll be a growing part of a low-cost carrier strategy going forward. Just to talk a little bit about some of our new routes. So on that page you can see some of the new routes that have been introduced in 2016. So a few US routes, Hartford, Connecticut, which is a gateway for Aer Lingus within the US, Newark with New York, and also LA. We've had 2 airlines come onto the LA route, Ethiopian and also Aer Lingus, in the last 2 years. And also, so we had some holiday routes for the first time into the West Indies and Mexico this year as well. So that's a major departure for us. In terms of our long haul business, so if we go back to 20 years ago to 1996, some of you may remember very, very limited destinations from Dublin. So there were literally just 4 destinations from Dublin, mostly served by Aer Lingus. That's changed significantly today, as you can see. So I think there's 17 or so destinations in operation today from Ireland, and obviously airlines like American Airlines run 4 flights a day out of Dublin, so it's becoming much more important. We also fly double daily to Dubai and Abu Dhabi, which has really opened up Eastern connections. And then 2 years ago, Ethiopia came on with a hub, our first scheduled hub into Africa with a base at Addis Ababa. Major targets for the future, we see this growing. We're very optimistic about growth. In addition to some further growth within the US, we see major destinations within Asia and I would say East Asia and Southeast Asia. We're working hard on a direct link to Beijing, but also some flights with Singapore, Jakarta, Bangkok, Hong Kong, destination Tokyo. Destinations that our new runway will serve. So extra length on our new runway will actually enable some of these destinations to be reached by modern aircraft at full loads. In addition, the new runway will strongly help us to serve some South American destinations, Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo. While some of these destinations in Asia and potentially South America can potentially be reached by our current runway, it does place a constraint on some aircraft types. So if you're an airline looking to bring on one of these routes and you see that with the aircraft you'd like to use you might have a penalty in terms of weight, it can make the route much more marginal at times. So extra length in the runway often helps to alleviate that concern. This year, we've had very, very strong growth, as I've shown, and for us, we basically process, a Croke Park full of passengers every day. But since 15th of May and 2nd of October, every week was busier than our peak week last year. So we're constantly finding ways to add more capacity and try and plan into the future. So this year in 2016, our runway is our next area of constraint. It's the next bottleneck in the factory. We look at the business obviously as a factory, so those are the hours during the day when we're full for arrivals and full for departures at similar hours as well. Our business is quite peaky in Dublin, so our peak hour is extremely important, and that's created by a combination of factors. One is that a lot of people commute from Dublin and therefore want to leave early. You may be frequenters of those flights as well, but we are with all of our destinations to the UK and also to Europe. We're obviously an hour behind Europe, so we need to leave that bit earlier. But for the UK, we facilitate flights. Get people to their desks at 9 o'clock and home that evening, or a few days later if they need to. But also the airlines demand strongly that their first flight out to get productivity on their aircraft, that their first flight leaves between 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the morning. And that allows them to get the maximum number of sectors on their plane for the day. If we can't facilitate that, we're at significant risk of them taking that aircraft and putting it somewhere else. If you're a major multinational business like Ryanair, you're just weighing up a Dublin route against somewhere that you can get more productivity from the plane. So clearly, being able to facilitate capacity at the times that it's demanded is extremely important. So that leads me on then to the runway. So our north runway is, you can see a diagram there. So the black figures on that drawing are our terminal base and what we call the horseshoe at an airport. So most, if not all, airports are built around a horseshoe type structure, one-way entry and exit. On the bottom of that drawing is the existing southern runway, which was built around 1989. Didn't even need planning in those days. The good old days, one might say. And there is a crosswind runway at the airport, which you may be familiar with. The problem with a crosswind runway is it can't be used at the same time as as the other runway for obvious reasons. So in actual fact today we land and about 95% of our movements, often more, maybe 97% of our movements in a year take off on the southern runway. The northern runway then is parallel to that, so that does allow what we call mixed mode departures, so we can land and take off on either runway at the same time. And as you can see, it's a little bit longer. Talking about the history, so the north parallel runway has actually been part of the plans within the airport since the 70s. But it wasn't until 2005 that planning application was lodged. We got planning permission in 2007, and then unfortunately with the fall off in demand from about 2009 to 2010, the project was put on hold. And it was only with when we saw growth coming back that we were confident that we could progress the building of it. In addition, you may be familiar, but Dublin Airport is a regulated business. It is essentially a regulated monopoly utility type of business, so we have a 5-year settlement or determination with our regulator, and they allow us essentially the capex to progress projects. So the North Runway was determined to be what's called a trigger project, so we were only allowed to progress the project when passengers got to 25 million. So that happened at the end of 2014, the beginning of 2015, which allowed us to bring back the project to life. I would say you're probably also familiar with the situation in the UK to a greater or lesser extent, in that they're trying to build a runway in the southeast of England. They call it their southeast runway project, but I always think that's a misnomer. It's actually a project of national importance for them. We look at that very much from that Dublin is the Royal Runway at Dublin is a project of national importance, and we're very fortunate, I think, that it is a project that's supported at a national level and within our national aviation policy, which was published last year, and that is a point of difference with the UK. For political reasons, not least the amount of the small Conservative majority in the UK, they don't have full support for their runway within the Parliament, and that is what's causing big delays there. We have policy support at a national level for this airport. I should say as well that obviously we have Cork and Shannon Airport, but they are much smaller in terms of numbers, and if you take the Republic of Ireland, we account for over 80% of arrivals and departures into the country by air, and about 70% for an island of Ireland level. So, Dublin Airport really is the main national airport for connectivity into the country. So there's a very strong business case, not least because we have a capacity issue on our existing runway, but there's nonetheless there is an extremely strong economic case for the runway. A longer runway will help us reach those extra routes and bring new airlines into the country, but it also facilitates growth of our US hub business. We have done an economic analysis, and we believe that we will get a 31% increase in connectivity by 2043 from the new runway. We'll facilitate an extra 2 billion of growth within GDP. We already estimate that we account for around about 4% of GDP. We support about 4% of GDP into Ireland through both tourism and direct effects. We will enable the creation of about 30,000 new jobs with the runway. So moving on to some of the technical details of the runway project. So I mentioned already it is parallel, which is obviously brings obvious advantages. It's 1.7 kilometers actually north of the existing runway. So that enables us to operate it independently. That's the minimum distance for independent operations. We are lucky as well that there's been strong planning within Fingal County Council over the years to maintain a strong corridor, and I'll show some pictures of that in a minute. But development has been kept predominantly away from the airport, but also over the years the airport has been able to acquire land sufficient for the runway. That's different again to the UK, where both with Gatwick and Heathrow to expand, they need significant amounts of land purchase in areas which are very expensive. It caters for Cat 3B operations, which means that it can operate in any weather, so there's not going to be any closures of the runway for weather. It's 60 metres wide. It has what we call 7.5 metres shoulders on each side, and those shoulders are essentially parts of the pavement that wouldn't have as strong a foundation structure, so they're not for wheels, but they're sufficient that you can get on some of the largest aircraft overhang of engines and still be within the regs. So that width of runway with those shoulders is required for the largest aircraft, which is the A380. So within our plans for our next sort of 20 years, we do see some A380 usage, and indeed we're talking with one airline at the moment about bringing that plane to Dublin. As you can see, it's served by a parallel taxiway to the south, which is designed specifically to allow the most rapid access and egress to the runway. It's got what we call RETs, rapid exit taxiways, which are the sort of diagonal exit and entry routes midway down. So those are strategically located to allow different aircraft types to get off the runway as fast as possible. So the most valuable commodity in an airport is runway time. So the faster you can get planes to leave that runway, the faster you can get the next plane either to land or to take off. There's been a lot of thought. It looks fairly simple, but there's been a lot of thought into the runway system and the taxiway system to make it as efficient as possible. We will have to build a second fire station. So our fire stations, which are manned obviously all the time to enable the airport to operate, need to be able to get to the edges of the runway within specific time, no longer than 3 minutes, and ideally within 2 minutes to any part of the runway. And in order to facilitate that, we will have to build a satellite fire station. And then all around the edge, you can't see it on this drawing, there's a perimeter road for access vehicles and maintenance vehicles. Just this slide here, I hope you can see it up there, but this contrasts Dublin Airport, which is at the top of the drawing, with Heathrow on the bottom. And I hope you can see there that there is essentially a corridor from Dublin west and east, which is predominantly not developed. Whereas if you look at Heathrow, it's essentially all developed around Twickenham and Richmond area. So this is a reason why these are dramatically different projects. Obviously, we do have close-in neighbours, particularly in Portmarnock and also Malahide and Swords. There are some to the west. There are some communities as well, long-standing communities, which we have strong relationships with, and we are in dialogue with them constantly about the runway. This is a comparison of the distances with Dublin and London. So what we've looked at is if you move about 6 to 8 kilometres to the east in London, you get to Kew, to the east of Richmond, which is essentially where Portmarnock is within Ireland. So that's a sort of an equivalent distance, but you don't go over anything near the number of houses in Dublin as you do in that journey from Heathrow. This is the comparison with Gatwick. So obviously Gatwick is a lot more rural, but there are a lot more houses and communities in Gatwick than there would be as well in Dublin. And that translates into some just stark comparisons, really. So if you look at the number of residents, the number of people living within a 60 decibel contour, so that's an average decibel level of 60 during the day. You have 123,000 people. This is a fairly small, tight-in contour compared to the 1,500 for Gatwick, but only about 800 for Dublin. And that, with roughly 2.2 or 3 people per household, it translates into about 50,000 houses in Heathrow, with 250 at Dublin. In terms of noise complaints, we do have complaints. We monitor complaints a lot, but we have about 1 complaint per 1,000 movements compared with 200 complaints at Heathrow and 85. So this is supposed to demonstrate that whilst we do have a noise, we do monitor and take care of a lot of noise. It is not on the scale of some of the other airports around. And similarly, from a cost perspective, when we compare exactly the other costs at Heathrow and Gatwick to ourselves, or even indeed to Manchester, it is a value for money project. So our budget is 320 million euro in Dublin, compares very favourably with Heathrow and Gatwick at 5 and 8 billion. The reason for that is twofold. In the main, number one, they don't own all of the land, so they will have to purchase that land. And number two, given that there are so many more residents, a large part of the budget is to provide insulation to houses that are close in. So we will be providing exactly the same level of insulation as would be done within Heathrow or Gatwick, but there's a lot less of it to do. Just to talk a little bit on the runway side about the phases. So we announced the project around about April of this year. We are spending this year, the bulk of this year, we have 31 pre-commencement conditions, some of which are significant, and we're spending the months up to the end of October to discharge those conditions. And then we have 2 packages of construction. The first will kick off towards the end of this year, and that's we have some road diversions to do. We have to prepare some of the land and strip away some of the topsoil, and then starting next year, the main construction package, which is currently out for tender, will start on site, and that will last about the guts of 2 years, and then there'll be a commissioning period. We operate the airport. We provide the infrastructure, but we don't control the airspace. That's done by the IAA, which is a completely separate company within Ireland, and they need to build a new tower to operate this runway. So we will be working at the latter period in conjunction with them to commission the runway. You may or may not have heard in the national press that we do intend to change 2 particularly onerous conditions. Those are conditions 3 and 5 on the runway. The first one prohibits the use of the north runway itself at night time, and night is defined between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. And the second condition states that when the runway is built, when construction is completed, not when the runway opens, but when construction is completed, a limit on overall movements at the airfield, so that's both or any runway, comes into force, and that's at 65 movements per night, again during the hours of 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. This summer we've actually had about 100 movements during those hours. So when I mentioned again that our early morning was a very important hour and contained our peak hour, those flights come back late at night as well. So that, coupled with some nighttime cargo movements, which are very important to us, but also some of our long distance arrivals in the morning, contribute to that number. And there is no facility, or there is no known way of going to airlines and telling them that they can't operate those flights once the new runway comes into force. In fact, we don't control the slot movements. So because we're a regulated business, the slot movements are an independently regulated activity, and airlines make an application for slots every year, and an independent business based in the UK has the contract to assign those slots. So it's kind of unprecedented that they would say themselves, it's relatively unprecedented that somebody would come along and give them the challenge of taking away 35 movements or more once more capacity is added. So we are currently considering how best to address this. Yesterday, actually, the government announced that a new competent authority had been appointed for noise issues in the country, and the process that we follow to address these these conditions will be dictated by whatever process that competent authority comes forward with. So I talked about having to actively reduce capacity. So we have done a study about how many passengers we would lose in this scenario. So we see an immediate drop of 2.4 million in the year that the runway opens if these conditions stay the same, and that's accounted for by having to lose those 35 movements, but also there's a calculation about the knock-on impact of that throughout the day. I mean, you're all familiar with the fact that if planes are late in the morning, they're late throughout the day. So that's just a feature of airports running at high capacity. So the same thing is going to happen basically, and indeed at the margin we estimate there will be some based aircraft pulled from Dublin. So that means you don't just lose the first flight, you lose 4 or 5 flights throughout the day. And so we also estimate that by 2037 that we will still be growing, but we'll be 6.3 million passengers below where we could be, and that's a total passenger loss over the period of about 80 million passengers. So we will be submitting a process to change those operating conditions, and as part of that we will be proposing mitigation measures, so similar mitigation measures to what we have in our current planning. And just to take you through what those are, one is that there's a voluntary dwelling purchase scheme. So we are offering to buy on a voluntary basis a number of houses, close-in houses for some of our residents. It's not a CPO scheme. It's not conditioned as a CPO scheme, or compulsory purchase order scheme. So it is a voluntary scheme. We're offering to buy out a lot more houses than are required under the planning, and we're offering a premium to market price. That is a scheme that is under consultation, and the consultation period is just closed, so we're in process to discharge that. We also have a noise insulation scheme for anyone whose average sound level is over 63 decibels. We are offering an insulation scheme for them. So that's for windows and other cavities around the house and roofs or ceilings. We're offering 40% more houses than is required by the planning. We also are conditioned for certain named schools within the areas, we have to, if their average sound level is over 60 decibels, we have an insulation scheme for them. And we're also providing some compensatory habitat for the area. We're providing 3 hectares of parkland close in within Swords, and then another 8 hectares of replacement habitat for any displaced wildlife over our area. We also have an engine testing area, which is a site within the airport because we have a maintenance business, but also because certain planes, when they go through an overhaul, have to do a regulated amount of checks. We have an area where they can test their engines at full throttle for a period on the ground. We're going to move that to a quiet part of the airfield. And finally, there's an enhanced drainage system to protect the runoff. As I mentioned, our local communities, we do work closely with our local communities. We've invested 2.6 million over the last 10 years with various elements and activities. We sponsor the local GAA club in our close-in neighbours, for example, just as one example. We plan to increase that funding over this project. We've dedicated community liaison teams, and we've had intensive engagement since we launched our project. We have a specific community liaison group for the St. Margaret's village, which is our closest village. We have an environmental working group, which includes public representatives as well in the area, and we deal with on a one-on-one basis anyone who wants to talk to us. So in summary, on the runway, it's a well-advanced, urgently needed project to deal with near-term capacity constraints. There is significant economic and connectivity benefits for the country. We're developing it within our own land bank at a lower cost certainly than incurred at other airports. Our budget is 320 million. That is more than the amount that was allowed by the regulator in the last determination in 2014. About half of the increase of that amount is accounted for by inflation, construction inflation, which has come back strongly into the market, and a half of it is accounted by other elements that need to be delivered, for example the fire station that I mentioned. We do plan extensive mitigation activities in excess of the planning requirements, and we are seeking, as I mentioned, to address the onerous planning conditions. So that's really all part. I'll come back, and if anyone has any questions, I'll take those at the end on that. But I was going to move on now to talk to another major capital project. So I should just say before I do that our general capital project at the capital program at the airport, I'm only talking about two elements of it today: the runway, and which is a major project, and Dublin Airport Central, another major project for us. But we have a third, we have an ongoing regulated capital spend at the airport, which is about 400 million over the 4 years. Obviously, this is the first regulatory period since T2, the first period that T2 operated. So the focus on this capital program is much more around airfield maintenance and upgrades to the airfield, having spent a lot on the terminals. But there are, in addition, a lot of other developments, both of a commercial nature and a terminals nature, in our general capital spend. But I'm not really going to talk about that, but I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Moving on to Dublin Airport Central. So as was mentioned at the start, we have about large land bank. So we have about 2,500 acres owned at the airport. Right in close in the centre, in the horseshoe, is a three-part area of about 70 acres, which is in three parts. So you'll recognise in the bottom right-hand corner of that page maybe some of those parts. So the first bit closest in is car parking. It's right up to the Terminal 2 multi-storey car park, and it includes the Clarion Hotel now. The middle part includes the Radisson Hotel and some car parking and office space, and then the furthest out to the right is a seasonal car park that's called the Green Car Park, which is used periods throughout the year. So I mentioned we're a regulated business, but essentially we acquired these areas of land away. So the parent company acquired these areas of land away from the regulated business in 2014, and now they will in time become another business unit for the airport. I mean, we look at the standard business of an airport is threefold. It's obviously landing and airport charges for airlines. Secondly, it's very strong retail business, obviously facilitated in an airport. But the third main income stream for an airport is property and commercial property. We're underserved in this, strongly underserved. Many airports around Europe will have developed an airport city, which is a destination in its own right, usually positioned between other suburban locations and the city centre, so at a discount to city centre rents, although that's not always the case in many places, but at a premium to some of the more established suburban locations. So we intend to develop this. We got rezoned 2011. That's a picture of the master plan. So we got a specific rezoning for what's called high-tech zoning, which is essentially a word that enables us to do most commercial uses, but also some high-tech manufacturing, which we don't intend to do. But it's not residential in any shape or form, which is not appropriate really for so close into the airport. But it's basically commercial development for large scale businesses, not to compete with the local areas. So the idea is to be seamless with the connectivity offer at the airport, so to be a location for high-tech multinationals. We don't see ourselves competing with Silicon Docks, for example. It's not the right place for that kind of business, but certainly for other, be they pharma, financial service, multinationals, or even large Irish indigenous companies, we're a very strong location. We offer straight in. We're connecting right into the terminal, so you won't need the terminal to get to your desk. And all the benefits that being at an airport will offer. There are examples of this. So the exemplar international example is Schiphol, already 60,000 employees there, 500 companies, and it trades at exactly, its rents are at exactly the same as downtown Amsterdam. It benefits strongly, not just from the airport connectivity, but it has the busiest train station directly underneath the airport, so you can understand from that why the rents are as strong as downtown. So having rezoned this in 2013, we appointed a team. I see Tony up there from Arup, so you're on the team there, Tony. We had a team to look to develop a master plan for this area, which we did. We took a long-term perspective, and we developed a master plan for the entire 70 acres. The idea is to build this out in a long-term period, but we could get up to 300,000 meters squared of hotel and commercial development. And then we worked with Fingal to take elements of that master plan into their own master plan for the area. The zoning required us to do, and required Fingal to do, a master plan for the area, which was non-statutory, but was completed in the early part of this year. We kept it into the close-in part, so the close-in part you'll see on the top left there, it's only part of the first of the three areas, and that is for about 77,000 square meters of commercial development. 7 buildings, in addition to the middle building there, which is the old Aer Lingus headquarters, which has been revamped at the end of last year, beginning of this year, and let in its entirety to ESB International. So I don't know if anyone here is from ESB International or was, but they're going to be moving en masse out there towards the end of the year. We're delighted to have them there, and they're exactly the kind of international based business that I think will really profit from a location at the airport. So that's an example there of what it looks like and what it does today. Basically we have just received planning for our first cluster. So there's Terminal 2 on the bottom. We received planning earlier, about a month ago, for the first cluster of 4 buildings, and a multi-storey car park, which is situated between Terminal 2 and ESB, and that's essentially what it's going to look like. So they're buildings around about as tall as the T2 multi-storey, where we added 4 stories earlier this year. There's a multi-storey car park only for staff, not for passengers, behind it. And there's a large element of green area in front and then running all the way down, and that's a reserved area for 2 functions. One is clearly for to create a green zone, of a sense of place for the area, but also to give us optionality in terms of the rail links when that comes. So these are LEED Gold. In fact, we've achieved, I think, LEED Platinum. We're one of the first buildings to achieve LEED Platinum in the city for the HOB building let to ESBI. There is a direct terminal link from the 4 buildings into the multi-storey building, so to access the development you'll just go through T2 and through the car park area where the car hire is, and turn right at that point. So we worked very closely on this. So traffic access was a big issue for us, so we had a lot of discussions but directly then with the traffic transport agencies, with TII and NTA in particular, and we did a lot of modelling using both the VISM traffic modelling, also the Saturn traffic model with the National Transport Authority, and then at a more micro level in the internal roads around the airport we did a lot of modelling of those as well. These are some of the impacts. So I would say that the M50 is a big concern right throughout Dublin, but in particular for us, but also being at the intersection of the M1 and the M50 was a big concern for us about what the impact would be. So that was what we found was that the impact was reasonable in the first stage. Out to 2018 we'd be having a small single-digit impact. The highest one there is our link road, which is the road between the airport and the M1 exit to the airport roundabout, but that is a road has got significant capacity on it. So this modelling showed essentially that there was, in its current configuration, there was enough capacity, albeit that the M50 is experiencing capacity problems and will continue to to experience those. So both models basically gave us the same impacts, and that was enough to get the support of the transport agencies. We reduced the capacities at their request, so the models actually showed that there was capacity for about 8,400 cars per direction per hour. But we reduced that. We penalised our models to show a smaller amount in both the M1 and the M50, just to reflect the fact that it does appear that the capacity issues are possibly worse than maybe the models are showing at the moment. So overall, the summary of that is that there's enough development and capacity to allow this at the airport, and also not to penalise passenger capacity and passenger access. We're very supportive, clearly, of the Metro North project, which was announced last year. It can't come soon enough for us. 2025 is far too late for us. We're reliant on other bus projects in the area to get us through to that, so enhanced bus capacity, but also the Swords, the city Swift service, the new Swift service. We're hopeful that we'll see that between Swords and the city centre. We do buses. Busing is a major part of the airport. In fact, I'll skip on a little bit here to say that you'll see on this slide here that in terms of our mode share. So this chart shows passenger mode share, but also employee mode share. So our passenger mode share at the airport is actually very, very good, and compares favourably with other European airports, which are much better served by rail. So we have about 6% of our customers arriving using at the airport by bus, and only about 37% or so from cars, including car rental. About 22% of taxis. So taxis and buses have really taken up the slack of a lack of a rail service. But we feel that if we want to increase those figures in any better now, we're going to need to move to a rail solution, basically. The Dublin Airport Centre is very, very strict. First of all, on employees, however, we're not so good. So at the moment, about 2/3 of our customers of our employees right throughout the airport arrive at the airport by car. So we do provide historically a lot of staff car parking. Something we have to look at. It's something that's not replicated within our Dublin Airport Central. We are complying much more. In fact, we're stricter than the Fingal and car parking within the airport. So we have a major mode challenge for our tenants. The reason that we are so strong in our mode share for on private cars with our employees is that we're very much a shift operation. So as you can imagine, we have a large amount of people arriving at the airport at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock to go to work, even earlier than that, and a large amount of people going home very late in the evening. And they're just, at the moment, there are, despite the fact that some of the private buses like the Air Coach run 24/7, they become the only transport option for us, the only public transport option for us in the evening and early morning. So very limited options. So we're trying to work with all the transport agencies to ensure that whatever new facilities are introduced, they reflect the demand at the airport. Having said that, half of Dublin Airport Central staff will live within a 60-minute public transport journey of the airport. Obviously, 60 minutes is out at the margin, but that is reflective of where people who work at the airport live today. So there is hope, I think, and Swords is 20 minutes away by bike, Santry 20 minutes away by bus. So Dublin City Centre is becoming more accessible as well by bike, and we have very good cycle tracks at the airport, within the airport area, but also into Swords. But then they tend not to be used. They're on very busy roads at the moment, so we need to improve that. In our planning permission, we've been strongly conditioned around a workplace travel plan. We do have a mobility management plan, a very good mobility management plan at the airport. We have a full-time mobility management manager who basically works with us and also our partners, be they tenants or partner companies at the airport, to try and encourage different areas of mobility. But we have a specific workplace travel plan for the new development because our parking constraints are so severe. And we'll be bringing in a range of public transport options which you would be more likely to see at the inner city. We won't get the bike scheme to come out to us, I think, yet, but we certainly will get other kinds of shared transport modes, and we'll facilitate those and do things within our tenant base to allow that. We have actually required all of our tenants, ever existing tenants, and we will be for our new tenants as we build, to sign up within their contracts to put people on our mobility committees, and they sit there, and we've also invited the transport agencies to be on that. So I think certainly TII, who are very concerned about the M50, they're very happy to be on that, so they can influence our policies there. But I think we're all, we all share the same interests. So that chart there shows some of the just some of the activities that we're trying to do to encourage other modes of transport. We are also trying to bring on other bus services from the DART to the airport as well as part of this. That's just the bus between Swords and the city centre, and we are looking at car. Basically, we are controlling access to car parking. So the only way we're going to achieve this is essentially a forced compliance through reduced car parking access. So people will need to get registered and just limit the car parking spaces. We have a car sharing scheme and a carpooling scheme as well. So in summary, we have land, the land available for this and within our control. We've got planning for our first development we hope to be building by the end of this year. We are developing the compelling proposition, which has started with the HOB, which is fully let, and our vision will hopefully elevate us onto the Airport City platform and further build out the suite of and the experience for tenants and for passengers at the airport. So that really was my presentation. I've managed to speak for a good 50 minutes. I hope it was of some interest. So I'm happy to take any questions now.
Just if you could, Ali will run around with a microphone, so there's a number of viewers online, so if you could just wait till the microphone comes to you.
I might just ask the first question if it's okay. Great presentation, John. I just wanted to understand, I'm sure everybody's tired of hearing Brexit, but I just wanted to understand how that impacts you as the development officer within the DAA, and does it affect your forward planning?
Don't know. I don't think anyone knows the answer to Brexit. I mean, I think the first thing we would say we've been monitoring Brexit since before the vote happened. Obviously, a lot more since the vote. It's extremely unclear. The first thing I'd say is that we've had really strong growth within airlines, but I do think that airlines is a cyclical business. Air travel is a cyclical business. I do think we're at the top of the cycle. I think that we're heading down into a downturn. That's not to say that passengers are going to fall off significantly in Dublin, but I think Brexit will contribute to that, but it is a downturn. And so certainly I would say that the growth rates we've seen at the airport are not going to continue at that rate into next year. So whilst I would expect growth for us next year, I would say that it will moderate. Long term, we do think very long term in terms of our infrastructure. I think that we see continued growth. I think the effects of Brexit will probably be more long term than they will, and they'll be more gradual. I think that we'd see continued growth at the airport, and we see ourselves. I mean, historically, Dublin Airport has grown it's grown at about 10% compound annual growth rate for the last 20 years, which is, and that includes the downturn, which is tremendous, really. So it's, even if you look at the growth rates of the country over that period, we're probably at double the growth rates, which, I think represents catch-up and the beneficial effects of catch-up within air travel. But really, so we just see that reverting to mean, really. So as long as the economy continues to grow, we see continued growth of air travel and growth at the airport. So I think there will be impacts. Obviously, there's the duty-free issue. You know, will duty-free return on the Ireland-UK route? But I mean, that's a debate that's going to happen over the next 2 years. So, you know, many of the effects, I think, will be gradual and won't be known for a while.
Okay, thanks, John. Questions?
Thanks. Thanks, John. It was a fabulous presentation. I'm Donald Minnock from TII. I suppose the obvious question to me, I was just very impressive to see the growth rate. I think was it 15% in 2014 of that order. But I think the passenger numbers are about whatever it was 27 million at the moment, which is like significant growth. But I think in 2037, it just occurred to me that you've talked about T1, you've talked about T2, you've talked about Dublin Airport Central, but presumably T3 must be on the radar as well if you achieve anything like the numbers you're talking about, and if you're successful with the unclasping of those conditions.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we do think very long term at the airport, and we do think in terms of we have a master plan. Our last master plan was done around 2010. We've just kicked off another master planning process. It's started and due to finish in the middle of next year. We'll be consulting with yourselves and obviously a lot of other agencies through that. That's a really important process for us. That we've got two major questions in the master plan. We take a 30-year development horizon on our master plan, and in fact this one has a passenger scope of about 55 million passengers, so a doubling of today's passengers. The two major issues for us, firstly, is what is the future for this Crosswind Runway when we have developed the North Runway. Major questions, because you know it is a major part of our infrastructure in an airfield. But when we have two other runways, is that going to remain as a runway? Is it going to become a taxiway? Is it going to become a main access route between the runways? The second major issue for that master plan is do we need a third terminal, and if we need a third terminal, where should that go? The answer to that at the moment, but I can tell you what the last master plan said in 2010, which was that we didn't need a third terminal until passenger numbers grew to about 50 million. That might sound unbelievable, but you know, you can imagine if you can remember back to the bad old days of 2007, 2008, we were putting 23.5 million passengers through one terminal in Terminal 1. Now, nobody is suggesting we would ever go back to that. However, there is a lot of scope for significant expansion to the T1, in particular to the T1 footprint, with more stands and more gates provision. And that is certainly one option, and was the conclusion of the last master plan, because there is a tremendous amount of economies of scale by being able to use to continue with the one horseshoe, if that's possible. Now, surface access is going to be a big issue for us to see if that conclusion still holds. And we think we can accommodate them 55 million passengers within the terminal structure with expansion, but can we get them in through the east side of the airport is a big question that needs to be answered.
Okay, thanks. And just one further question. I didn't, forgive me if I missed it, but the 320 million price tag that you mentioned there, and that you're a regulated business, is it public sector subvention, or are you going to try and abstract private funding, or is it a blend? Or is it a kind of some sort of an arrangement where you're going to get a return from your tenants to fund the development of the city?
So we're proud of the fact really that we're the probably major transport infrastructure provider in the country that doesn't have any money from the state and never has. So essentially we're funded solely through passenger charges, which the airlines pay us, also from commercial businesses, which are taken into account by the regulator in setting a cap for our aircraft or for our passenger charges. So in this period, our passenger charges are actually reducing by 4% per year, and currently stand at around about 10 euros, reducing to 8.50, I think it is, by the end of 2019. So there is no demand or request or need for public sector money for any of what I've spoken to you about today. The airport is funded through the passenger charge. That's the regulated business of Dublin Airport. ARI, Dublin Airport Central are competitive businesses within the DA umbrella.
Hi, Gerald Cummins. So just following up on that, but I had a separate question. So the airport's credit rating must be pretty strong at the moment, anyway.
Yeah, our credit rating has
now?
been improving.
Yeah.
I think we've had 2 upgrades.
Yeah.
We have just had a successful 400 million bond issue.
Yeah.
And that's been enabled by 2 upgrades over the last year. I think we're AA minus now. So we tend to, our credit rating tends to improve as the country's credit rating improves.
Absolutely, yeah. So the question was that it's just the planning conditions. I can see how you're building the arguments. Just the process that you're going to have to go through. Have you got any clarity on that?
No, not really.
Yeah.
I think that there's a regulation came into force in Europe, regulation number 598, which sets out the need to develop what they call a competent authority for noise at airports. So it's a pretty specific regulation.
Yeah.
It just deals with airports, and it just deals with aircraft noise. It obliges countries to designate a competent authority, and then that competent authority makes decisions in relation to noise and what we call operating restrictions. So we would define anything that sets a limit on planes or sets a limit on noise at an airport is an operating restriction, and decisions of those are set by the competent authority. The government yesterday, or the cabinet yesterday, agreed to appoint an element of the IAA as the competent authority for noise in Ireland, and we await to see what the process that will.
So there needs to be some handoff between on board Prinola and the new authority then.
There will have to be some handoff or coordination or collaboration, let's say, between on board Prinola and other bodies, I would imagine.
So you need a whole process and infrastructure around getting this decision, because the planning decision is getting things reversed or changed. There isn't a clear process at the moment. It doesn't happen. So you need to build this whole new regime. So timescales.
Well, I've given you the timescales for the build program. The timescales for what we call the change of use application around the removal of those conditions. I can't tell you. So
you're just steaming ahead with what you want to do and hoping
but
sense will prevail.
We would expect that. We certainly expect that there'll be clarity on that process in the coming weeks, if not months, and we'll be engaging in that process. We've been doing a lot of work to prepare for clearly no regrets moves. We're preparing an environmental impact statement at the moment. That work has been ongoing for many months. So we've been doing all the surveys. We've engaged in our first public consultation on that environmental impact statement in June of this year. We've completed a scoping document. We've got a lot of responses. We've got about 700 responses in total from the public, from politicians, from the statutory bodies, and we will be engaging in another consultation process in the coming months.
I think it's really good to see that you just kind of confidently and proactively going ahead with what you want to do and getting all the building blocks in place, and you're not sort of wringing your hands about anything. Just this is what we need to do, and hopefully it'll all fall into place.
Well, thank you.
But you help, with and the preparation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, as I've said, it's an incredibly important project for the country. There is, the National Aviation Policy clearly sets out that, we need to be a gateway for the country, and, we are not to be any kind of a blocker on, there's a direct impact if we start to reduce traffic through the country, we start to reduce productivity within the country and creation of wealth for the country, so it's a very important project, I think, for us all.
Yeah, I suspect that the forecasts you showed were quite conservative, really, on the impact. It could be a lot worse than that, really. They'd start pulling based
Potentially,
pulling based
we've tried
aircraft.
to take a realistic view on, but what I said earlier about people pulling planes is, that is a real phenomenon.
Oh, absolutely, that'll happen really quickly. Yeah. Mm. Okay, thanks. Really good presentation.
Okay.
I should introduce myself. My name's Anton Daltoon. In the good old days, I worked in Aer Lingus HOB.
Hi.
And I did have an influence, I think, on ensuring that your problem was building the north runway, not building the south runway, because the original plan was to build the north one first.
I did hear that, yeah.
I think it would probably be more difficult to build the south one today than the north one.
Yeah.
I mean, the key, I think, is the question of the constraints in operating times. And I think part of the difficulty is the way that DAA is looking at it in terms of the good old days. I mean, I remember fighting battles about keeping Chapter 2 noise airplanes for another 5 years, and we're now, I think, at Chapter 4, basically. Measures change, and what's acceptable to the public changes. And taking it as a baseline, what's already there, I think is brave or perhaps foolish, and I wonder if the IAA will take a broader view and say that what's there at the moment is unreasonable, in particular in relation to passenger airplanes, and in particular in the way that the DAA has gratuitously brought in airplanes at the 5 o'clock in the morning kind of timings, which contribute virtually nothing to the economy. For instance, I'm referring specifically to Ethiopian, which to me is essentially something designed to impress the world rather than to generate economic activity, and it comes at the very worst time. And I'm not surprised if the locals in St. Margaret's react to that. I would like to ask you about the runway length and what that's driven by. The south runway, when it was built, was actually determined by JT8D-9 737-200 and getting it to the Canaries.
Okay.
That happened by sheer coincidence to also allow you to take a 747 Dublin to New York. We weren't allowed to say that at the time. And of course, airplanes have improved. So I would think, if I was Michael O'Leary, which I'm not, I would take a very poor view of determining the length and the cost of the Dublin Airport runway by a very hypothetical operation on a very heavy, underpowered airplane from Dublin to Sao Paulo or Jakarta or someplace, which conceivably might happen. But to design any airplane around the worst, or any airport around the worst possible case, is really a guarantee of extravagance. I remember Sabina, I won't ramble on, I promise, but there was a European group which wanted to produce a common specification for an airplane, and that was driven by the need of Sabina to operate from Antwerp to the Canaries, which would not have been a very sensible thing to do, so in the end the specification collapsed. And thanks. And again, it was a very good presentation.
Thanks for your questions. Look, I would say, firstly, we don't have restrictions at the moment. So, in relation to what you mentioned first, there will be an independent regulator of noise, and they will make decisions on whether there should be in the future. We think there's a very, very strong case that the restrictions that are conditioned in the planning permission are onerous and too onerous for us and not in the country's good. So we'll make an application for those to be removed through that. And it'll be up to them to decide whether or not that's warranted, and they will do that initially, and I'm sure that'll become an area of expertise. We're used to living with regulators. We've safety regulators, we've economic regulators, a noise regulator. So I think that people should be confident that those decisions will be made in everyone's best interest. In relation to Ethiopian, I mean, we see Ethiopian as a really important addition to the airport. It opens our first major African base. Addis Ababa is, the second most populous country within Africa after Nigeria. It's a stable economy at present. It has the best African airline, and there are great opportunities for transfer for Irish passengers through Africa to South Africa to West Africa, afforded by Ethiopian. It adds significantly to our connectivity. The times they land at are dictated essentially by them, and I don't think they would have. They do have flights through Dublin, but I think they wouldn't have the full business and plans for Dublin that they have if we weren't able to accommodate them the way we do. In terms of, you mentioned the length of the runway. The length of the runway is always obviously there's the planning permission settled on 3.1 kilometres. That was done after detailed study of aircraft types and destinations. So I'm sure that in the early days of the previous runway, Dublin to New York might have been a marginal destination, but there's many flights a day to that. So I would think that many of the destinations that are currently, or that might seem marginal today, could become important destinations for us in the future. I would say that interestingly, some of the newer aircraft, for example, the 787 Dreamliner, it's a very efficient aircraft from a fuel perspective, but one of the trade-offs on that is that it actually requires a slightly longer runway to take off from, because it uses less fuel on takeoff than some of the older flights do. So the length of runway is not always getting shorter as planes develop. We also, whilst a lot of our aircraft are Airbus 320s and Boeing 737s, we do have to cater for the 20% of our customers which are not the home-based airlines and who do have different aircraft requirements. So I would say one more point is that one thing that is happening is that aircraft are getting quieter, and there is a significant, if you look at, for example, even the A320, the new A320s are significantly quieter than the Boeing 737-800s, and the A350s, which are coming, the new A350s are significantly quieter again. So I do think that whilst volume of aircraft will continue to exacerbate and drive out noise contours and people affected, I think that there are continuing beneficial effects from aircraft noise, and I think we will see dramatic changes in that continuing over the coming years.
Okay, we'll just take one more question then.
Thanks very much. Thanks, John, for your presentation. I'm Donald Lamont. I work with one of the airlines as a compliance manager. And I've been in Aer Lingus and I've flown airplanes for years. Okay. A few things come to mind. Let me just say about the planning restrictions. I'm very positive about the rate of growth and about the potential and about the future. I'm a bit scared about those conditions, I have to say, because they actually don't mention noise. And I know they're based on noise. And I'm only being picky here now. I'm just suggesting that you're going to have to be very smart in relation to how you deal with overcoming the constraints that are there, because none of us wants to see the runway being completed in a couple of years' time and sitting there because it can't be used because the constraints that are in the planning approval suggest that you have to have a lower level of operation than currently is being done by the other runway. And that's the problem. I'm only making that as a comment, and it scares me a little bit. And I think, let me go on no further than that. I could get into trouble if I said any more, but I just have a bad feeling about that one. The second one is perhaps a criticism. Your 320 million is based on a Category F airplane being taken on a 28 right or 28 north. And that airplane, that A380, is now going into recession. The rate of production is being reduced. There's one airline operating in Dublin at the moment who has intimated that it may be interested in operating at Dublin. Now, I know the rules are that you can't now build a runway that's not designed for a 380 and allow a 380 to use it, whereas you can use an old runway that is not 380 designed and allow a 380 to use it. So therefore you could use 380 on 28 left, the existing runway. but you couldn't actually use one on 28 right because it's built since the regulation changed. Now, given that the airline we're talking about is saying they might use a 380 to Dublin, and that nobody else is going to ever order a 380, because I don't think that's a fair statement, that because it's not going to happen. Those that operate them are pretty happy. They do a great job for the passenger, but they don't offer the economies that can be offered by the newer 777s and A350s. In that circumstance, I'll ask the question, which you're not going to answer, and I wouldn't expect you to answer it, but I'll put the question anyway, which is, what is the additional cost in building the runway and taxiway network to accommodate the A380, other than that would be providing for the the wide-body twins today? And I think there's a significant cost there. And the final point I'll make too is in relation to surface transportation. And I'm kind of disappointed that the DAA hasn't taken a proactive role in improving the surface access. Now, I know you've acknowledged that there are options there, but when Clongriffin Dart Station was extended, was actually inserted a number of years ago, they produced extra platforms on it, which of course nobody wants to talk about. But that station, 7 kilometres due east of Dublin Airport. It's exactly the same distance as Orly Val in Orly, which runs a driverless train between Orly Val and the Orior network and the airport. And it would seem to me to present a pretty obvious solution, and I think it needs some positive activity on the part of DAA to move ahead of that, because the Metro North may arrive in 2015, 2025, or it may not. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for your questions. Just take the one about surface access first. We didn't make the call. It was the North Dublin Transport Study last year, which came down very much in favour of the metro over the Dart Spur. We have future-proofed for whatever ultimately comes. As I said when I described the green area there, has the capacity for. We've thought about future-proofing for another kind of rail spur into the airport should that have to happen. I think about Stansted. Actually, I don't know if you're familiar with the airport there, but there is a heavy rail line into Stansted which is just below grade, so covered below grade. I think that we think that there would, if that were to happen, it would have to be some kind of a solution akin to that. For us, one of the most important things with the rail solution, well, the most important things with the rail solution for us are capacity of the trains, frequency of the times they arrive, and also it's that they come into the airport rather than stand out on a far away, be it that the R132, which is the main road that run before the runway, motorway, and that's all about passenger choice. So I showed our mode shares. If we are to reduce the car, be it taxis or private cars at the airport, we need to deliver a competitive rail solution. And when we looked at the overground solution on the joining the Dart line, we didn't see as much capacity in terms of train frequency. The individual trains are big, obviously, but in terms of joining an existing busy line which already has other train lines on it, other train lines joining it a bit further north from Malahide or the other line, we saw a capacity issue potentially on that, but it wasn't our choice in the end, and we have been making strong representations that whatever was chosen needed to deliver those things for the airport. In relation to your other point, which was about the A380, our plans do, it's not going to be the most frequent plane at the airport by any manner of means, but our plans, when we do schedules, projected schedules for 2022, and we do them also for around 2040. There are surprising number of A380s in those plans by airline, based on what they tell us and what we impute ourselves, and it's not just the one airline that you're mentioning there, although they certainly have plans. The additional cost, you're right, I'm not going to tell you what that is, but I can guarantee you that in the overall context of not just the runway budget, the overall project cost, but of the actual physical cost of building the runway, it's not a significant amount of money to build for that. And you know, we are constrained that whilst we can land an A380 plane on the existing runway by exception, under what's called a DAD, to get technical about it, we do need to show a program for fixing that anomaly. It's a temporary allowance, and we would not get away with building a new runway and continuing to have that facility on the existing runway. So hence the need to essentially plan that into the cost of the new runway.
Okay, thank you, John, for that excellent presentation. Just a couple of things left, and I'd just like to say to echo many of the comments that were made here this evening. It's incumbent on our transport operators and providers here to support you for expansion plans. It's a massive investment in the construction, both to the economy. So just to wish you the very best on that. A couple of remaining items. Our next lecture from the Roads and Transport Society will be held here in Clyde Road on the 12th of October. So if you pencil it into your diaries, the emails will be sent out in due course. But we'll have Robert Rooney from ANL Goodbody coming in to give us a presentation on the Construction Contracts Act, and that will be a 4:30 start time, just to facilitate a greater numbers attending at these lectures. Just finally then to thank the committee members, Ali Gleeson, who is our PRO, Deirdre Neff, who is our secretary, and Donald Minnock, who's our chair, our vice chair. And just finally then to call on Donald to do the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Oliver. Well, I'd just like to on a fantastic presentation tonight. Very, very interesting. It's funny, just on the topic of the DART interconnector, I think a couple of years ago we had CIE representation in here, and they gave a very good articulate presentation on the concept of DART interconnector. But as it happens, we have ties with our Australian New Zealand branch as well, and I happened to be at a presentation recently where one of the projects that they're championing in Melbourne is called the 50 level crossings project. And basically it is to address the fact that they have a fantastic rail infrastructure and light rail infrastructure, but they have 50 level crossings that need addressing badly. And that is the equivalent of, I think the budget or the price tag was like the order of $6 billion. So it's like 50 Newlands crosses. So I suppose the one thing that wasn't alluded to in the presentation a couple of years ago was, well, okay, we can provide a DART interconnector. Well, what would that do to the residents of, you know, Bayside or Calestra or whatever, at all those junction locations with increased frequency of trains and trams or whatever, or dark lines. So, and in terms of railway order, etc., would it be any more deliverable than the 2026 target for Metro North? I don't think so. But however, the NTA strategy or the Greater Dublin Area strategy is in place now, and hopefully with improved economic conditions, that 2026 deadline can be beaten, and maybe things can be accelerated with improving financial circumstances. I think, just in fairness, what I found very heartening was just the sheer growth in the volume of the figures, your passenger numbers. And I mean, it's something that we see in terms of the national road network, and in particular, say, with respect to the toll roads that we manage. The growth is there, which suggests to me that people's value of time and their, you know, what they're doing, it justifies them paying the toll, and I think that just reflects the economy and the improving circumstances that we find ourselves in. It's a very ambitious project. I think it's fantastic from the that as engineers we'll all recognise. I think did you mention 30,000 jobs being created out of the project? I mean, and then including all the construction and the technical projects. I think that's what obviously the economy needs, and it's at the core of what the government is trying to achieve. I think also, just from my own travails, having been with an Australian wife, I've been to that side of the planet on many occasions now over the last 15 years. But one thing I've always noticed was how Singapore and Abu Dhabi presented as these gateway airports, you know, hubs, if you like, and it always did strike me, well, is Dublin not like a gateway to Europe, a gateway to the States? And it's very heartening to see now that map where you had your destinations plotted, that now Dublin will be, you know, that we are striving to take advantage of that strategic location and kind of service the more long-term destinations, and maybe we're box and clever as well as a nation in terms of taking advantage of Heathrow and the capacity issues that it suffers from. But so all in all, I'd just like to congratulate you on a very interesting presentation, and I'd just like to call upon the attendees here tonight to thank the speaker in the usual fashion.